The last thing we're going to look at is problems with having multiple database objects created. So here in our main method, we're creating our planet table DAO object here to access the database. And we might have multiple versions of this because we might have another activity that'll create that, and from this activity we might start up that other activity. Sometimes you'll have different windows, different pop-up windows, or maybe fragments inside this activity will recreate this. So you might have multiple versions of this data access object here. And so we've got to look at handling that. So again, from our main activity, we might be creating multiple ones of these, and we can get into trouble with having multiple access to our database and our database helper here. So we're going to change our database helper to always return the same database, even if it's been created or not, and do that. And we're going to use what is called the Singleton Pattern. To do that. So the Singleton pattern guarantees that we have only one database out there, and we're going to implement it here because this is where we create the database to do it. Here's a link that talks about this and how it's set up. So again, we often get in these errors where we'll be having these exceptions where we'll have SQL database is created but never closed or stuff like that, and often means because we have multiple versions of it open. So there's two approaches. We're going to use a Singleton approach now. There's another approach called content providers, and we're not going to use that approach, just a little bit beyond the scope of this class. So in order to do the Singleton approach, we declare a static instance of our object. So within our helper object, we declare an object of that type. It seems kind of weird, but we create a static instance of this. The static instance means it'll be in a separate memory location outside the object, or in a static memory area. And so if we have multiple instantiations of the objects, they all share the same static memory. So it'll be out there. So then when we create our database object, we'll get an instance of it. So get instance is a method that's already defined. What we'll do is we'll check if this value is null, and if it is, we'll create an object. Otherwise, we'll return this object, this singleton instance. So we're going to have to modify our object to do that same thing. So let's look at that. So I'm going to go into our helper object here. These are our fields so far. Now I'm going to have a new field. It's got to be a static field, and it's got to be the same type as our helper. And we have to give it some name. 10. Okay, so here's our single instance of our database object here, our database helper here. Now we're going to again declare a method to return that. So I'm going to put that right after my constructor here. So it's going to be public because we're going to need this outside. It's got to be static because it's going to be have to refer to these static values. Synchronized means it's thread safe. So only one of these will be able to run at a time, and that's important because we might have multiple threads or multiple activities running at the same time. And we're going to call it get instance. We can call it everything we want, but get instance is the typical version when we're using the Singleton pattern. Now we're going to specify, just like in our constructor here, we're going to specify the same parameters as in our constructor, the context. So again, we're going to make sure we're doing it. Now we just have to make sure I've changed this name a little bit. Okay, so we're going to check if this singleton parameter is null. And if so, now we're going to create a new version of our database helper here. Database helper. So now we're going to call the constructor here. Now, and then we're going to always return this instance. So again, if this instance is not null, meaning we've already created the database, we're going to just return that. So this will return the current database that if it's already been created, or return a link to the newly created database if it hasn't been created. So that works this way. So the only thing now we have to do is make sure we don't want to call the constructor. do not call this anymore. We want to call this get instance. So where do we call that? In here where our database access object is. We were calling our constructor here, database helper dot constructor. We just have to add our dot get instance in here, and luckily it has the same parameters for that. And again, now this is creating this is calling new for us, or if needed, so we don't need the new here anymore, because again, we may not need a new database. It may give us a pointer to an existing database if it's already been created. Okay, so this implements the singleton again. So rather than calling the new and calling the constructor, we call this get instance. Get instance handles this, checks if the database is null, and if so, calls a constructor. But if the database already exists, passes the database back to our method. And again, this is called a singleton pattern. It's used a lot when we just need one version of an object in all of our methods. Okay, so this wraps up our data access object stuff.